Welcome all. We have a star-studded panel, and my only regret is we don't have a huge amount of time, so we're going to try and do this as a lightning round of insights all the way. Mike, I have to ask you to start us off because you're in the last 100 days or so of
97, but who's counting?
of an extraordinarily successful term as mayor. What do you think, coming out of the business world, what is the main thing you've learned about being mayor? What's different?
Well, basically, there's an awful lot more similarities than differences. The objective is to get the great people, give them authority to go along with responsibility, have their backs, get them the resources, make them work together. And that's true whether you're running a business or a city or a state or a country. And if you can attract the best and the brightest from around the world, they'll come up with the ideas. The executive's job is not to do that. The executive's job is to find the people.
When you look at, I'm going to stretch the meaning of the word resilience here because I have to ask you this because I know people are wondering. When you talk about a resilient system, do you think the American system is resilient enough to withstand what is happening in Washington these days?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the good old days were never the good old days. We've had partisanship. We've had parties go out of business. We've gone through crises. And as Winston Churchill said, you can always depend on the Americans to do the right thing after trying everything else.
We're currently in that phase.
We are indeed going through that phase.
When you look at the issue of resilience in New York, I first want to again talk about the challenges beyond just what one thinks about, which are relating to climate. How do you make a city thrive and survive in today's economy? With all the challenges that the economy has today, what do you think the key to the success of a city is?
It has to be open to everyone. Very diverse population really makes a big difference. You have to have a raison d'etre. The city's got to have a spirit and a reason why people want to go there and live there. And one of the problems with Washington, D.C. is everybody lives there, but they look out. They never think they're going to stay there for the rest of their lives. They're always waiting to go home. New York City or other great cities, people want to come there. And today there are more people that are moving to New York City than leaving for the first time in decades. We have more tourists than ever before, more people have jobs than ever before, and that creates a dynamic place where the best and the brightest want to be. And if the best and the brightest want to be there, they'll create and generate a tax base so that you can take care of the less fortunate. But the real key, and it's not a populist thing to say, not popular to say because it's not populist, but you have to have the wherewithal, those people who are willing to think out of the box, try new things, start new businesses, take risks, if you're ever going to have a future. Otherwise, you do the same thing, and if you do the same thing, we know where that ends, not prettily.
You've also talked about how it's very important for a city like New York to have a bunch of very rich people, so you could tax them.
Sure. Yeah.
You're unapologetic about that.
No, well, the fact of the matter is a very small percentage of the people pay the preponderance of the taxes. And if you don't want the tax revenue, then you can lose those people. But if you want to have the ability to go and invest in infrastructure, invest in cultural institutions, have social programs that can really help people who are less fortunate, you have to have the dynamic drive, the people that are creative, and the revenue. And that comes from people who do well. And in our city, the poor actually are a little bit better than the poor in other big cities. But the real reason for this great inequality, as people describe it, or gap in income, is we have been very successful in attracting the very, very wealthy. Those come here and they spend money and they create businesses, and they can go elsewhere. They are very mobile. They're the one group that has the resources to go. But interestingly enough, if you were to take the top 20% out and look at just the 80% that's left, the income or net worth is 100% correlated to academic achievement. And more, we are going to be facing the fact that the demands for society are greater, and perhaps greater than we can teach or the average person can learn. And how that works out, I don't know. But it is clear that If you have a better education and if you can be more creative, you will do better. And if you don't, then unfortunately, you're going to be struggling.
Jim Kim, sketch for us the broader issue of resilience. You've looked at cities all over the world. You're doing work at the World Bank trying to help these cities. What do you think is the challenge they face?
Well, you know, cities are responsible for 70% of the carbon that goes up in the air. So we have to think about how cities are structured, how they're built, because first of all, you know, the future of the planet really depends on how we build the cities. But at the same time, we see that disasters have been increasing, and so cities have to build in a kind of resilience to be able to respond. Mayor Bloomberg certainly did this after Sandy, but the numbers are really kind of staggering. So you know, 70% of all the carbon emissions. China itself, in the next 20 years, is going to have 1 billion people living in cities. So one country will have 1 billion city dwellers. And if you look at how they're doing the planning, in some places, cities are well planned, cities go forward, but in the vast majority of places, cities don't even have the capacity to begin planning for resilience, to begin thinking about their carbon emissions. Only about 20% of all the major cities, including in developed countries, can measure their own greenhouse gases. In the developing world, what's really difficult is that cities are not creditworthy. So of the 500 largest cities in the developing world, only 4% are internationally creditworthy. You know, there's a higher percentage that are nationally creditworthy, but they need the financing, they need the technology, they need the sort of know-how to plan and build cities that will be cleaner and greener, more livable, and at the same time, make the contribution they need to make to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions.
Do you think that for cities of the future, as cities look out to the future, a core element of what they have to do is to plan for big floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, depending on where they are, that this kind of resilience in the face of very erratic, extreme weather is going to be essential?
It's essential, and the tragedy, when I tell you that the 500 largest cities, only 4% are creditworthy, it means they don't have the capital to really put in the kinds of safeguards that Mayor Bloomberg, for example, is putting in right now. And so what I hear, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia said to me, you know, we are suffering in so many ways from the carbon that we didn't put out into the atmosphere. In other words, when the extreme weather events hit, it's the cities in the developing countries that are hit hardest. They have no means to protect themselves ahead of time, and they are always struggling to find a way to respond because they don't have a FEMA in most of these countries. So one of the things that we need to do is we have to figure out ways of using a lot of very, I hope, what will prove to be innovative and useful tools to find ways of providing the kind of finance that these cities need.
Judith, Rodin, when you look at this at the Rockefeller Foundation, what do you think is the key to building this kind of resilience?
Well, resilience is about the ability to rebound more quickly and more effectively after these shocks and stresses. We know they're coming, but we can't predict everyone. If you just look at CNN's news over the last 2 weeks, so terror in Nairobi, new earthquakes in Pakistan, Western Pacific hit with typhoons, the Colorado flooding, that's just the last 2 weeks. So things that we thought were once in 100-year episodes are now coming with such frequency. So we need much more robust systems. We need better building codes and land use planning. Obviously technology, because we have to get real-time information and real-time decision-making. But we also need to build community capacity and social resilience. The mayor talked about education and the education gaps. It's interesting if you think about Medellin, for example, that they decided that the way to combat the drug cartels and the terrible violence that they had was really to build social resilience, to build a much better education system, to build a community fabric. The response in various neighborhoods in Chicago to the 1995 heat wave, which was totally unpredicted, had to do community by community, equally hard hit by the kind of social and community fabric. So resilience is really about all of those elements and more than climate change. The next shock could be terror. It could be an economic crisis. All of the elements that it takes to rebound more safely and more effectively need to be there. And that's what New York is planning for, others are. And Jim is talking about innovative finance that's necessary, but we've been working in Asian cities that are very sensitive to these shocks. And the reason for Reed cities, 75% of the world's population is going to be living in cities in the next 20 years. Many of those, most of those actually, are on fragile ecologies or coastlines like New York or the cities we're talking about all over the world. So it's not that this focus prevents us or tells us not to worry about the broader populations, but if you talk about where you're going to get more bang for the buck, the focus really has to be on these metro regions in every country in the world.
The one thing you do know is that the next disaster is not going to be the last disaster. That no matter what you think about and what you plan for, that's not what you're likely to face. But what is important is that you do planning so people realize how to get together. You make sure you have your communication systems. You make sure you have management in place. You have to have somebody at the top who is a decision maker. You have to have the communication system so you can tell the public what's going on and rally support. And if you take a look, we had certainly not planned for Hurricane Sandy. It was a 1 in a zillion time. The way that hurricane hit us is not the way any other hurricane has ever hit us before. And we certainly didn't do everything right. And one of the things that we focused on a lot was not only to get people back in their homes and to come up with a plan for the future, but to look and see what we didn't do right, where we didn't have enough resources and that sort of thing. And that is not sexy. Nobody wants to spend their money and nobody wants to talk about it. It was when I first was in office, after the first 100 days, the press wanted to write a 100-day story. What have you done? And I said, well, I'm almost finished putting together a team. Yeah, you're right, but what did you do? Well, I said, there's this team. They just could not get the concept. What we did in the first 100 days lasted for 12 years.
And we've put together now a challenge called 100 Resilient Cities, because we know that not all cities around the world have the experience or the appetite that New York does or Rotterdam does, even though both of those cities have applied in this challenge as well. And we'll be choosing, we've had 1,300 registrants from 6 continents. That's over 600 cities ranging from Lagos to San Francisco, from all over the world. I won't mention any more because too many cities to mention, but it's really interesting what kind of pent-up appetite and need is revealed to all of us to do this. And we'll create a platform of services that will give each city a chief resilience officer, the person at the top that the mayor talked about, the access to innovative finance in collaboration with the World Bank, the leading technology in the world in collaboration with Palantir, who will do for all of these cities big data analytics and the opportunity to do real-time decision-making through information. You know, the mayor can tell you that after 9/11, we learned that our emergency systems didn't talk to one another well, and New York has responded to that in their planning for the subsequent events. The Washington Navy Yard, the Metro Police couldn't communicate with the Naval Police or the federal responders. So we've got to take the lessons that we learn in one place and transport them around the world so that every city doesn't have to have its own disaster in order to figure out what to do next.
Jim, you see this as pretty fundamentally related to climate change, which suggests that since there's a lot of CO2 up in the atmosphere, no matter what we do going forward, and given that China and India are going to put a fair amount more, no matter what we do, we're in for a very interesting next few decades.
You know, we really are, Fareed. And there's still argument about this, but you know, the report that's going to come out on Friday is going to say that we're 95% sure that man-made climate change is real. And the issue is, I think what both Judith and Mike are saying are really important, is that we've got to stop having these arguments about, you know, whether this is real or not. I can't believe we're still having the discussions. Because in many countries in the world, they've stopped having that argument. They're moving forward really quickly to try to build cleaner cities. I was just in Shanghai, and they're doing things in both the private sector and the public sector that are really surprising. The greenest buildings anywhere I saw in Shanghai. And what they're doing is, as soon as they reach a certain level of greenness of a building, the government comes in and changes the standards so every new building has to meet that standard. Right? So all around the world, people understand that this is an issue. I was in Delhi, and the Supreme Court mandated that all buses, all public transport had to be run on natural gas. So I had this out-of-body phenomenon. I was sitting behind a bus, and black stuff didn't come into my face. It's really moving out there. I think people understand it, and so the critical thing is to do exactly what Mike and Judith were talking about. But here's the problem. We say this all the time. What we need to do is capture innovation, get good things that are going, and spread it. But there's no way that happens. It doesn't happen right now. And what you'll see is innovations that are happening in Shanghai don't spread to Beijing. Innovations that happen in New York, which are really exciting, what's the way for us to capture those innovations and make sure that they spread? At the World Bank Group, we're devoting a lot of time and energy to doing just that. We're in China, the Premier Li Keqiang. The first day I met him, he said, I want a report on urbanization that tells me about all the greatest innovations in the world around building cities. And I also want you to study all the innovations in China, because we're actually not sure what they are. And so in the process of doing that report, our commitment to them and to the world is that we're going to do everything we can to make sure that those lessons, not just on what to do, but on how to do it, what to do next week that will give you the ability to do it, we're going to try to take those lessons and spread them as widely as possible, and working very closely with Judith.
Mike, you have tried both before but even after, particularly after Sandy, to lay out a plan for New York in terms of investments that would make it even more resilient. It strikes me that you run up against two big political problems. First, there is still a big debate, certainly in Washington, as to whether climate change is real and man-made. And secondly, there is not an appetite for big public investment.
Well,
How do you get around those?
The problem with big public investments is the payoff is down the road. And we live more and more every day in a me, now, I want it kind of world. And we're unwilling to make investments for our grandchildren, and we're getting to the point we're unwilling to make investments for our children. And so if we've put more money in the last 12 years into building this third water tunnel to give us some resiliency than the previous 5 administrations. I don't know what's going to happen afterwards. Will they continue to do that, whoever the next one comes? But it's very easy to say, we'll cut back on infrastructure and we'll focus the money on delivering more services, which the public's demanding right now. And one of the things that is the most annoying to me is in New York City, we do most of our infrastructure with city dollars. We don't get very much from the state, and we don't get very much from the federal government. We had some, and thank you very much to both. But fundamentally, we are doing it with city dollars. And then other cities come along, say, oh, New York's a high-tax city. Leave there, come to us, bring your jobs to us. And then they want to start a national organization to get federal money for infrastructure. I mean, what I miss here, we're doing it ourselves. But in the end, companies want to be where cities are making investments. Companies want to be where cities have good infrastructure and understand the need for it. Companies want to be where cultural institutions are thriving and that sort of thing. So in the end, we will win with our strategy, but it is annoying where people don't want to make the investment and then blame the system. And all they have to do is reach into their pockets and they can fix it.
What about climate? Just one. What about climate change? Because you've gotten into trouble for your views on climate change.
Well, I would argue, don't make the argument that the world is going to be different 50 years from now. Nobody cares about 50 years from now. It's like Congress saying we're going to have some standards that have to be met by the year 2050, which is only, 37 years from now. Nobody's going to be around. Not one person in Congress is going to be in Congress then, so you can't hold their feet to the fire. You've got to make it for me, my kid, now. One of the things we do is we plot where kids who show up in the hospital with asthma attacks live. And you can have a map of the major roads through New York City, those coming across the Judith Bridge, particularly where the traffic is very slow and very concentrated. That's where all the pollutants come from, and that's where the kids come down with asthma attacks. And we have made a lot of progress. We're going to have a big announcement tomorrow about some of the progress we've made in cutting the contribution to the world's problem of pollutants in the air. But New York City has one advantage. 80% of our pollutants come from buildings and 20% from transportation. Every other city that I know of in the world is exactly the reverse. And so for us, you can focus on a few buildings. You can find some incentives, which we have programs of loans and laws that force you to change from heavily polluting thick oil and go to natural gas, or in some cases solar and wind. And we can make a difference. We're halfway to our goals for 2017, I think it is, of cutting our pollutants by 30%. And it's really because we were able to concentrate on the buildings. We do some with transportation. There's hybrids and that sort of thing. But the real answer in our case is to attack the buildings.
Judith, you were going to say?
I want to make sure that people really understand that it's not all about expensive long-term things down the road, that there are so many things we see New York and other cities around the world doing. So soft infrastructure in coastal areas, how you
Like
wrap
what?
your shoreline, building sand dunes and berms, how you think about your trees being planted. We have in New York under the mayor 1 million trees being planted.
That Middle's program.
Yep, it both takes carbon dioxide from the air, but it also is incredibly important to give cover in heat waves, and it has a resilience capacity in maintaining ground soil during flooding. So these are pretty low-tech, low-cost things. Building codes. We hardened our building codes again in New York after Sandy.
Painting your roofs white.
Painting your roofs white. Lots of low-tech, really important solutions. And as Jim said, we see so much in the developing world because they see these things every season. They see the droughts, they see the floods, they see the typhoons, but also the disease, the public health effects of climate change. So they are making real-time changes with really de minimis resources.
You know, Fareed, the thing is, what the mayor said is so clear. You've got to give a sense of what's going to happen in the near future. I have a 4-year-old kid, and by the time that he's ready to graduate from college, Bangkok could be underwater. Now, I meet with the island nations all the time, and they're saying, oh my goodness, you know, if you doubt climate change, just come and visit us. I mean, these people are at risk of losing their country, right? So the thing that we keep stressing is that there are things we can do right now. I mean, we're all waiting for the big agreement around a price on carbon. I mean, that's what's going to have the biggest impact. But in the meantime, fossil fuel subsidies make no sense, don't help the poor. We need to get rid of them, but it's hard politically to do it. Climate smart agriculture. There are so many ways that we can change the way we do agriculture that not only increase yields and decrease malnutrition, but actually put carbon back into the ground, protect riverbeds. There's so many things to do. And cities right now. So cities are being built. And what they're doing is they're locking in a particular kind of fossil fuel use. They're locking in a particular kind of development that if we can just get on top of it and spread these lessons right now, they could go down a very different path that would be perhaps a little bit more expensive early on, but much more effective and much more value later.
What about mass transit? Because that seems to me one of these areas where if you look at what the Chinese are doing, they're really trying to put people into these high-speed rails, subways. New York actually does very well compared with other American cities, but isn't this a big problem for the United
Well, we
States?
couldn't get any money from the state government to expand the subway line. We needed to take down the West Side to develop that whole thing. And so we came up with $2 billion of city taxpayer money. Now, the state MTA is doing the building, and they've done a very good job, actually, on time, on budget. They deserve a lot of credit. But the state government would not come up with some money. It's just not sexy. And when there is limited resources, there are other things that will get you more ribbon cuttings and photo ops and please constituent groups. And democracy is responsive. That's the good news. The bad news is it's not necessarily going in the right direction. And sometimes you look at some of these other countries where they really don't have as much democracy, but they're better able to focus. It all depends on the person at the top. If the person at the top is intelligent and wants to make investments for down the road, they'll get done.
Do you look at a place like Singapore or in Chinese cities and say these guys are planning for the future?
Well, there's no question about that. We had 20-odd mayors from Chinese cities in the other day in City Hall, and all of them were talking about the plans they had, and they are actually going ahead. It's not to say that I'd rather live in China and have China's form of government, but there's no question that China is going to be the next big country that has a very big environmental agenda. I know they're still building a carbon-fueled power plant every week, But all of a sudden, they've got the following problem. They brought 150 million people into middle class. Those people don't want to breathe air they can see. They don't want to drink colored water. They want to be able to get to work and get home. They want to be able to be healthy and live longer lives. And the Chinese government is a very responsive government. They've got big ethnic problems in the West, and this is another problem they don't need. And so I think you will see them change the whole economic development at any cost, environment notwithstanding, to all of a sudden environmental things. And
Absolutely.
what Jim said was he saw that already. And I see it at C40, they're starting to send mayors, or the mayors come, and they don't do that without permission from the central government. We sit around and we complain about the Chinese. We should look in a mirror. It's America that's where the people don't believe in climate change, or some. It's America where they don't want, because for political reasons, don't want to make any long-term investments. Or when they do, they're so responsive to the demands of a handful of companies that want to enhance their profits, they don't do what's right.
It's a fundamental.
How do we rate? Take Mike's point. You look at the whole world. How are we doing? You know, is this a serious problem for the United States?
Well, I mean, just look at what Mike talked about. He set a goal of 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. He's going to get there by 2017. So this is one of the great stories. New York City is one of the great stories in the world about how you can make a decision, get the policies in place, get the incentives in place, and then things just move. So what is clear to us is that the way you build your cities is going to have everything to do with your competitiveness in 5, 10, 15 years. And it should be a no-brainer to think that those who are really thinking about sources of energy, transport, how to provide healthcare, education, those countries that do that are going to do so much better. 75% of the people are going to be living in cities. If you do that well, you're going to be more competitive.
Do you think that there are ideas that can get across the political divide? Because as I said, it seems to me in dealing with this issue of resilience in the United States, we have to face the fact we have these two big political obstacles. Climate change is controversial still, and public investment is controversial.
I do. So Mike and other mayors that I see all of the time, we work with mayors all over the US and all over the world, regardless of whether they're Republicans or Democrats or independents, they need to deliver services on the ground in real time to their populations. And so they feel much less vulnerable to the political debates around climate change. Not every one of them, but we see the closer the elected official, the mayor, or even a governor in some states, is to the ground and service delivery, the more these become esoteric arguments. They need to fix it. And so we're starting to see, we talk about subways in New York, but in Latin America, they have really not had a lot of heavy infrastructure investment in transportation because they've developed amazing systems of bus rapid transit that act like light rail. We need gold standard bus rapid transit in the United States, much lower infrastructure investment. We need to clean up our riverways, and we need to clean up the gutters and our waste management. In Colorado, Boulder did a fantastic job over the last 15 years in raising their bridges and building floodways, but their waste management is going to create a horrible problem for their cattle and their agricultural productivity. But the cities next to Boulder didn't raise their bridges, so you develop a plan over time, and you have to think about the variety of services that you do. If you're going to repave a street, pave it with materials that are now available that absorb water more quickly and release it more slowly. You're going to spend the money on the paving anyway. If you're going to open a street to lay pipe or cable or new lines, invite all the companies that could benefit from the street being open. So in ways both big and small, we have got to get smarter in cities about how to use our money more effectively while we're building these long-term infrastructure responses as well.
The pace of change in the world is accelerating. It's Moore's law applied to everything else, not just to transistors. And we are running out of natural resources. Tom Friedman wrote a column the other day The populations, if I remember, of Iran and Egypt have doubled since the mid-70s, and they are running out of water. And that's going to be true. Even in the West, there are places they just don't have enough water. The pace of depleting resources and the ability to damage the atmosphere keeps growing. The danger that you can do with one piece of code or with a small bomb dwarfs anything that this world has ever had to deal with before. And as I said before, the requirements to compete in the world and to deal with the next iteration of progress put more academic demands on us.
But this, what you're describing puts a premium on planning, on figuring out where this is going, and yet when you have tried to do that, you get a lot of people attacking you for being a nanny and a nanny state and what do you say? No, this is real.
You're judged by them. I care about what historians say, not what journalists say. So, and it's very different. The same people that say nanny states also will tell you. I mean, there's one, I won't embarrass him, but he wrote this very nasty editor's column about how smoking was terrible. My smoking thing was terrible, and today he tells everybody I saved his life. So come on. Look, leadership is about doing what you think is right and making it work and then convincing people to come along. It's not about doing a poll and then doing what the public wants. The average person, me included, will never know. You need innovators. You need people that just are willing to take risks. And one of the great dangers for all of us is social media. Social media sounds great where everybody can make their opinions known, but it is very hard to innovate when you have to come up and face the critics before you ever start to build it. You don't know what it's going to look like. You don't know what color it's going to be. You don't know what it's going to cost. You don't know who's going to use it or anything. That's what innovation is all about. And people in a world where all of a sudden one kid with a computer sends 10,000 messages to a senator saying this is wrong, and the senator doesn't see it's the same message, the name changes every time. That makes life much more complicated for governments, and that's going to become more and more true.
What are you worried, finally? What are you worried about when you look at New York after Bloomberg? What are you worried about being undone, or a legacy that of government that will be perhaps eroded or atrophied?
Well, I think most of the things we've done, hopefully if we've done a good job, will stay in place. Yesterday I was in London. The weather was nice, so you think better of any city when the sun is shining. But London is a real competitor to New York. And we've got to understand, if we were to stop improving, stop diversifying, stop investing, we will get pushed back and other places will take over. I was in Paris the day before, and I had dinner with some people, all of whom talked about all their friends moving out of Paris and out of France because the tax rates are so high. Those are the people who are going to create the jobs and pay the taxes down the road. You can't hold the waves from coming in. You've got to keep making your society open, and you've got to keep providing opportunities. But if you start to focus on equal results rather than equal opportunity, unfortunately, you start to dumb everything down. And if you do that, you're going to get hopelessly left behind.
Last word, Jim Kim?
Well, the hopeful thing is, and it's not just London that's going to compete with New York. Shanghai thinks it's going to compete with New York. Seoul thinks it's going to compete with New York, and they will. But the great news about cities is that mayors, of all the politicians that I've met, mayors act more like CEOs than anyone else I've ever met. And that's why Judith's initiative on 100 cities is so important, because they are competing every day. So every day they've got to provide services. Every day they've got to attract business. And so what we found is that the willingness of mayors to really think more long-term, both in terms of competing right now, but building the kind of cities that will attract people over the long term, I think gives me hope. And so the C40 initiative that Mayor Bloomberg was so involved in founding, that is one area where anyone who cares about the climate, anyone who cares about their children, we've got to focus on getting the building of cities right. If we do, we can go a long way toward removing carbon from the air. For example, if we just do everything that we know right now and the cities move in a more sustainable path, we can take 10 gigatons out of the air. And that's the equivalent of the amount China puts in the air every year. That's how much we can reduce the amount of greenhouse gases we put in the air. If we do that, life will be so much more pleasant, both in the cities and in the world.
Judith, one final thought to leave everyone with.
What makes me optimistic is the young people. The negative parts of social media are real, but the innovation and the ideas and the engagement of young people, which is often a positive force, understanding when it can be a negative force. They get climate change, they will put pressure on the politicians, and if not, they'll change the world in ways that we can't imagine now. And so I really am quite optimistic about this next generation.
Mike Bloomberg, Judith Rodin, Jim Kim, pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.